You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Now it is time for our bi-weekly Women's Hockey Spotlight. That means we welcome back Erica L. Ayala. Erica, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing great. Always great when we get to talk a little women's hockey, especially with the playoffs right around the corner.
And talk to us about the playoffs. Looks like we're getting closer to knowing who the teams are going to be.
Yes, indeed. So we see that there are two teams that have already clinched a playoff berth and one team also that has already officially been eliminated. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But at the top of the table, you have PWHL Toronto and PWHL Montreal. As of right now, when we're recording, they have 44 points. That is Toronto, and 41 points for Montreal. So both of these teams are expected to host in the first round. And then also we've talked a little bit about the unique format, PWHL Toronto in particular, assuming they get to hold on to that number one spot, will get to pick their opponent. And so right behind number 1 and 2, you have Minnesota, PWHL Minnesota, 35 points on the season, PWHL Ottawa, and then PWHL Boston. So Ottawa and Boston, though, are neck and neck, 32 points in the standings, and one of them will be out and one of them will be in. So the weekend slate is going to be pretty important for this weekend. We have some teams that, are still looking to get in. And then, of course, the rest, specifically Minnesota, just looking to see where they will be seated. But, this is a PWHL Toronto team, Rachel, that kind of came out the gate a little bit slow, but now have been able to rise in the standings. We saw that Sarah Nurse got a hat trick the other night. When you think of having this kind of momentum going into the playoffs, I mean, do you think that this will benefit PWHL Toronto?
I think so. I think, one of the unfortunate side effects of, what Gil and I just talked about with the Toronto Maple Leafs forcing a Game 7 is that it's forcing this playoff series for scheduling reasons, because that's up in the air, into the Marlies building, which is a little smaller, which is a little of a bummer, I got to say, just because I know they could probably sell out the big barn. But that being said, I think that, I think Toronto has a ton of momentum going into the playoffs, and being able to pick your opponent is so huge. Who do you think they'll pick?
Well, we know they can't pick New York, New Jersey,
Right.
Long Island. We'll get into them in a little bit. But, I think it really depends. I don't even know if you necessarily just want to go with a team that's lower in the standings. I think you want to look at a team that maybe you feel that you match up with well. You want to have a team where maybe just how they scheme defensively in particular opens your offense up. So that's how I would go about it, Gil. And, they have some pretty talented folks at their front office, between Troy Ryan, who is their head coach, I should say, bench boss and front office. And then also, of course, they have Gina Kingsbury, who both are part of Hockey Canada. And so I'm hoping that they'll be able to really pull out the analytics. I know not all hockey fans are into analytics, but I feel like in this case, Gil, it might be good to take a look at minimum at just some basic stats and see how you match up.
Matchups are always important, especially in a short series. So you want to take advantage of, to me, you want to face the team whose style enables your style to work its best.
Right.
And, part of the equation when you're picking your own opponent, whoever you pick is automatically insulted. I mean, before you even start the series, they're
Very
insulted.
true.
So there's going to be a chip on their shoulder. It adds a little more juice to the whole playoff situation. So I really like that format.
Yeah, I mean, and again, just kind of going back to it, we know that so New York is off the table, but also so too is Montreal, because of what we said. Just kind of looking quickly at some of the results that we've seen, I think, Ottawa might be a team that Toronto does not want to play. We've seen that Ottawa is a team that's
Yeah.
been able to give Toronto some difficulty. We talked about earlier in the season, maybe things weren't exactly clicking for Toronto, but even in their last matchup, which was, let's see, the last matchup between Ottawa and Toronto was March 23rd, and Ottawa took that 5-3. So, and this is a pesky Ottawa team. They couldn't quite get it done and close the door against New York, excuse me, to earn their playoff berth outright, which did actually have ramifications in the draft, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But, I think it's going to be interesting to see if it's Boston that makes it I think it's going to be a little bit of a tough go for Boston here, but
Yeah.
maybe Toronto takes Minnesota, just if Boston isn't on the table, New York we know isn't on the table. So I guess we'll see. I'm very curious to see if we get some of the intel after the fact, and kind of what PWHL Toronto was thinking when it came to who they're gonna pick there. But Minnesota is a team that we are expecting will make the playoffs. There's only a handful of games left, and they are a step above in the points from what I just talked about between Boston and Ottawa. But also, they will be hosting the second draft in PWHL history. We don't have an exact date, but if my memory serves correctly, Rachel, the first ever PWHL draft, which was in person, which was really cool to see women's hockey get back to that. The CWHL had done that a few years. But this is going to be in Minnesota. We had the last draft, I think it was in September, like early mid-September.
Yeah.
And so some really interesting names that could be available in the draft. But we'll get to that a little bit when we talk about PWHL New York. We saw the draft in Toronto last year. I think it's great to see it stateside. I mean, selfishly, I like that it's stateside, especially closer to the middle, since now I live kind of in the middle. But I think it's going to be great. Minnesota has seen some really great crowds, and so I'm very curious to see what the production will look like. We had, I believe it was CBC that hosted the first ever draft in Toronto, and I thought it was a really great setup. I was able to be there, a little bit tight on space, though, I will say, and in the back of house when we were trying to interview players. But Minnesota has some great facilities. Obviously, they've been really received well at the same arena where the Minnesota Wilds play. That's a little bit of a difference from what we've seen at least in the NWHL, which also then rebranded as the PHF, where we first saw the Minnesota team play at Trio Rink, which is the practice facility of the Minnesota Wilds, and then somewhere just outside of the Twin Cities. But I think there's a few players on the board, Rachel, that I'm going to be curious to see where they go, including someone that we've talked about before, or a few players, several players that we've talked about before, such as Sarah Fillier, Hannah Bilka, Kayla Barnes, Danielle Sardachny, and technically Claire Thompson, who was supposed to join PWHL New York, has re-entered the draft, which is also strange to me, Gil, because we have a player that was, I guess, committed to the New York team, but because she's in an NYU, I think it's a doctoral program or a med student, she wasn't able to quite align things, or at least that's what we were hearing from PWHL New York. And then the latest is that she's entering the draft. So, like, I mean, when it rains, it pours for the New York squad, I feel like.
Yeah, and there's maybe a little more to that story than meets the eye as to why she never signed. How many rounds are they going to go in this draft? Do you know?
Yeah, I think it's about 4 or 5 rounds, just because there's only 6 teams. So but yeah, I think, and they did the snake draft last year,
Nice.
so
Well,
I'm
that makes
assuming that
sense.
that they'll do the same. So we might as well get into it. But the first pick we know is going to go to PWHL New York, and that's by way of them being the first team eliminated. They're the only team mathematically eliminated, but the way that the PWHL New York did the draft lottery, if you will, is that teams that are eliminated from the point of elimination, if they win the number 1 pick based on how many wins after elimination they get. Now, here's the rub, Rachel, of it for this year, at least. PWHL New York wasn't playing particularly well. They were the first team to get eliminated, but then because no other team has been eliminated, effectively they win 1 game after elimination and they get the number 1 pick.
Right. I think it's, with the league only having the 6 teams, like that's the way it's going to go for now. But I think you still have to set that precedent early that that's the way you're going to run the league. So I don't have any issue with it whatsoever. But yeah, I mean, Sarah Fillier would be a really good addition to that New York team.
And she, in theory, right, on paper would be. But another reason we have PWHL New York as a bullet point, Rachel, is because, and we've alluded to this before, a lot more people in media are talking about it, but like what actually was happening with PWHL New York? You've got some fantastic players from the Canadian national team, the US national team, Olympians. And on paper, you think that this could be a team that puts some things together, and they never did. I've said on this podcast before, though, that I found it interesting that multiple times, both before the season and then the PWHL New York Media Day was actually, I think, 4 or 5 games into the season, and I was there. And on even 5 games into the season, we had the head coach, Howie Draper, and the general manager as well, Pascal Daou, saying that they haven't watched film on their players. And so 5 games into a very short season, they're still trying to figure out where everyone fits. It was also 5 games into the season that we heard they were still trying to get Claire Thompson together and on the roster. But I mean, that just seems odd to me. We know that, unfortunately, at least for right now, women's sports have very short seasons. And to have a head coach and a general manager who effectively are putting together the roster, I would imagine are creating defensive pairs and lines, to say that they haven't, and it's not like there's not film. You mean to tell me you couldn't find film on Abby Rock, on Alex Carpenter, on Madison Packer, on Chloe Arard? These are all players who are elite level, either at international, at professional hockey before, and of course NCAA, and most of them all 3. So how you don't have film, and how do you actually build a roster if you haven't watched your players outside of what you now are creating to know if that's even a good matchup, Rachel?
Yeah, I think it's obvious there is a coaching deficiency this season for New York, and that is going to be a huge issue this off season. And if I were the league, I would step in and fix that before the draft, because like players are not going to want to go there.
No,
if nothing changes.
Yeah, and Gil, we also heard reports that players like Abby Rock were, if not kind of picking their own line mates, then very vocal about their frustration that the systems weren't working. I mean, we were kind of talking offline about, maybe a coach that Rachel and I have some familiarity with losing a locker room, aka Dave Haxtell getting fired. This seems, from someone who covers the Kraken, this seems much more egregious than anything that I heard coming from Kraken camp.
Well, look, if you're not watching film on your own players, I mean, I think the standings reflect the amount of effort put in to getting your team ready. And that's a shame for the players who really don't even get a chance to be properly coached and to strategize and to develop as a team.
Yeah. And then, this is also a league where we're ramping up the stakes. And so, like in every other professional sport, you want to play for a winning team, not just because you are a competitor, but also you're playing for contracts, right? Not everyone has a 3-year contract. Some people, are looking and jockeying for spots. And so it's not just a recruitment deficiency going into the draft, like you said, Gil, but also can you even retain the players that you have, which could be a huge problem. And what's wild, Rachel, is that they have a successful women's hockey coach on their staff. A few, actually, but I'm thinking specifically about Colton Orr, who turned around
Yep.
the Connecticut Whale. And that was a team that, because of their location, sound familiar? Because of their
Yeah.
location, they had a difficult time getting fans, but that changed as the coaching got better.
Yeah, and I will be the first to admit that I had huge doubts about Colton Orr going into that role with Connecticut, and my mind was completely changed, and I think he's a real solid coach, and he does take the time to get to know his players and put together a really good system for that team. So yeah, the answer is sitting right there.
So here's hoping, for the sake of, as you mentioned, Gil, the players, both on the, well, as we both mentioned, on the roster, and then those that will come, that they really get this fixed. And I was hesitant when it came to the Haxtell news to say that the head coach needed to go, but in this scenario, I really do think that the writing's kind of been on the wall. And again, self-proclaimed not watching film. I don't know how that's going to fly in a league that's really trying to level up women's hockey. I don't think that would really fly at any level. Unfortunately, we have also seen international teams where head coaches, not USA Hockey, just say, yeah, well, we don't really practice special teams before going into an international tournament. So here's hoping that we start to, again, just see that leveling up, and we get the coaching and, the strategy that is required to be able to compete at an elite level.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to dedication and just putting in the time, and let's hope that we do see that and get that straightened out for PWHL New York. Erica, thank you so much. Always great to talk a little women's hockey with you, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks.
Sounds good. Thank you both.